out of Philly, this is the Reluctant Theologian Podcast. I am your host, Dr. R.T. Mullins from the University of Lucerne. Did God create the number 2? Is the number 2 the sort of thing that could be created? Perhaps numbers and other abstracta are necessarily existent entities. Now, if numbers necessarily exist, does that somehow undermine God's sovereignty? These are very difficult questions, but don't worry. Today I have Dr. Paul Gould on to explain everything to us. If you'd like to support the show, you can donate money to my Patreon account or my Ko-fi account. Any donation amount helps me out in so many ways. I greatly appreciate all of the support that people have already offered. If you have questions or topics you'd like to hear on the show, you can send me a message at rtmullins.com. Well, ready or not, here's Paul and I talking about God and abstract objects. Enjoy. So I want to welcome to the show a group of people from Palm Beach Atlantic University. We are in the middle of our very first Palm Beach summer internship. This is a unique internship opportunity for students enrolled in the MA program in Philosophy of Religion at Palm Beach. So today I have with me my 2 summer interns, Andrew and Drew, and then I also have Professor Paul Gould. So let's have everyone state your name and briefly introduce yourself. That way the audience can start to get used to the sound of your voices.
Yeah, hi, my name is Andrew Drinkard. I do have a master's in theology and apologetics from Liberty University, but I wanted to dig deeper on these issues here in the master's program at PBA in preparation for possible PhD work in philosophy or analytic theology. So happy to be here. Thanks a lot.
Hi there, my name's Drew Mercantini, and like Andrew, I'm also pursuing the Philosophy of Religion Masters at Palm Beach Atlantic, hopefully in pursuit of a PhD in analytic theology as well.
And hello, everyone. My name is Paul Gould, and I'm really excited to be here with Andrew and Drew and Ryan. It just feels like a big party here, talking amongst friends. So really looking forward to our conversation.
All right, good. So I don't have any witty banter to eat up the next 12 minutes like most podcasts do, so I just want to get right into this. So, Paul, there is an inconsistent triad that's bothered you over the past several years. So why don't you just tell us what that inconsistent triad is, and then just why does it bother you so much?
Yeah, so good. So I'm always mindful of Bertrand Russell's book that he wrote in 1912, or was published in 1912, with the title, The Problems of Philosophy. And in that book, he was discussing just the perennial problems that plague us as philosophers, things like the problem of evil, or the mind-body problem, or the problem of skepticism. And as far as I know, in my dissertation, I coined the phrase, the problem of God and abstract objects. And then I have been exploring it since then. And there I lay out the problem in terms of an inconsistent triad of 3 independently plausible propositions. So here they are. So the 3 propositions are, number 1, abstract objects exist. That's just Platonism. Or maybe we could just call that abstract object realism. That's the first claim. The second claim is, if abstract objects exist, then they are dependent on God. And that's a claim that would flow from traditional theism, which includes the doctrine of what's sometimes called divine aseity and sovereignty, or just think of it in terms of God being the sole ultimate reality. And so that kind of flows from that. Anything that exists that's distinct from God ought to depend on God in some way. So that's claim 2. If abstract objects exist, then they're dependent on God. And then claim 3 is, if abstract objects exist, then they are independent of God. And that is a traditional Platonic assumption. And the reason why this is such a sort of difficult problem is that at most only 2 of those 3 claims can be true, and so one needs to be rejected. But no matter which claim you reject, other problems sort of surface. So for example, if you reject that first claim, that abstract objects exist, you lose, in my opinion, the best solution to the problem of universals and some other things, and I don't want to go that route myself. But if you reject number 2, then God is no longer ultimate, since then God is going to depend on these properties to explain his character and things like that. And that, of course, kind of lands you in non-traditional accounts of theists. And so for those who want to be traditional theists, that's not going to be an attractive option. And so it seems like perhaps 3 should be rejected, the standard Platonic assumption. And maybe the idea is that abstract objects depend on God in some way. But here there's deep problems as well, because then all these questions arise, like how does one necessary being depend on another necessary being? Abstract objects are typically understood to be necessary. And so it's just not clear how you get this sort of asymmetric dependency relationship. And one attractive option, though, that many have taken is to say, well, that these abstract objects causally depend on God. So God creates them, right? But then this other problem surfaces that's been called the bootstrapping problem. And that's the problem that if God creates abstract objects, and God creates all the properties, and God must first have certain properties to be able to create properties. And so you have this sort of vicious explanatory circle. And so you run into all these problems no matter which statement you reject, hence the problem of God and abstract objects.
Yeah, that's helpful. I appreciate you laying out the three propositions. And I know that your view, you describe yourself as a Christian Platonist with a lot of philosophical vocabulary. There's usually subdivisions that come after that. So what's unique about your Christian Platonism, and how do you differentiate it from other Christian Platonist options?
Yeah, good. So Drew and Andrew have you've heard me say, if we're going to be good thinkers, we need to learn to make distinctions. If we're going to be good teachers, we need to learn to teach distinctions. This is just J.P. Moreland, one of the early things that he taught me. And so I think it's really important when we talk about Christian Platonism to make some distinctions. That phrase, Christian Platonism, is just sort of flying all over the internet. It's flying all over, the literature. And so it would be important to sort of define at least what I mean by it. And so to kind of help clear the conceptual space here, I first want to distinguish between what I will call classical Christian Platonism and contemporary Christian Platonism. And even classical Christian Platonism can have kind of a narrow and a wide definition. Sometimes there's some who define it very narrowly as Augustinianism, or surprisingly Thomism, or something like that. That's a very narrow sense of classical Christian Platonism. Usually, on the wide sense of that term, it's basically a reference to the sort of high medieval age Platonic Aristotelian Christian synthesis that was kind of the resultant view as you kind of work through the tradition. So that's classical Christian Platonism, and that usually includes sort of a Platonic core of assumptions. Sometimes classical theism is in the mix there as well, or often it is, at least today. But I want to distinguish that classical Christian Platonism from what I'm going to call contemporary Christian Platonism, which is just the view that God and abstract objects exist. Here you have a thin and a thick version, right? So thin contemporary Christian Platonism is just the view that God exists and abstract objects exist. And there would be defenders of thin Christian Platonism. I think of someone like Peter van Inwagen, perhaps. He would be a thin contemporary Christian Platonist. I'm more motivated to defend what I would call a thick contemporary Christian Platonist, which would add to that thesis that God exists and that abstract objects exist. It would add this sort of thicker principles. Maybe they're theological theses. I'm very happy with this sort of Platonic core that's been delivered to us through the tradition that includes a kind of participatory ontology. So I'm going to add some of that to my sort of mature theory, but what I'm interested in is this contemporary debate, not necessarily the historical classical stuff, although of course this intersects with it. But I'm trying to make sense of, if you believe in abstract objects and you believe in God and you're a traditional theist as I am, how do you reconcile these two given that problem that we alluded to? And I can say one last thing then in terms of, even within these sort of thicker versions of contemporary Christian Platonism, there's a whole host of views. My view, I'll just kind of name it and briefly state it now. We can get into it more if you'd want. I adopt a view that's called modified theistic activism. So I suppose we ought to begin with theistic activism, which is the label to a view that was articulated and advanced by Chris Menzel and Tom Morris. Actually, in their 1986 essay, Absolute Creation, kind of advanced this view that God exists and God is the creator of all distinct reality, including all abstracta. And they identify all abstracta with things in the divine being, usually mental things as well. And so my version of theistic activism is modified in this sense, that I don't identify all abstract objects with constituents of the divine mind. So in my view, some abstract objects are constituents or within the divine being. And then there's this distinct from God abstract realm, called a Platonic heaven, call it whatever you want. And in that realm, I throw properties and relations. And I have some reasons for that, but I just don't think it's wise to try to identify properties with concepts, which is what the traditional theistic activist does. And so I modify in that way. But I do share with the theistic activists the idea that everything distinct from God is created by God, and that God creates many of these abstracta in virtue of the divine intellect, although some of them he creates in virtue of the divine will. So we can come back to that. That's in a nutshell the version of contemporary Christian Platonism that I am seeking to defend.
Paul, I want to ask you about the motivation for being a Christian Platonist. I know there are many different reasons, but maybe just give the audience one. Why be a Christian Platonist?
Yeah, it's tough to give just one, Andrew, but in fact, I just wrote that. So what I've been doing, I defended my dissertation over a decade ago, and then I got really busy teaching. And then lately I've kind of have some space intellectually and also just time-wise. And so I've been kind of collecting all the objections to my views and slowly kind of trying to respond to them. I think we'll talk about one objection in a minute here. And so there's essays that are coming out, in the next couple of years. One is in a book called Divine Ontologies, where I'm just defending some of the objections to this modified theistic activism. And in there, though, I do try to motivate it, because one of the objections is it's just unmotivated. Maybe there's like some motivation for Platonism. Usually it's like either the indispensability argument, or for me, it's actually the problem of universals. Some people aren't super impressed by that problem. But, setting that aside, like, what's the motivation for Christians? So I actually try to address that and give 3 motivations in that essay. I'll list the first 2, but then I'll just say a little bit more about the third, if that's okay. So I'll kind of half cheat. But in there, I talk about how Christian Platonism helps secure this sacramental view of reality and this tight connection between the sacred order and the natural order. And that's something that's really important to me, I think, is this recapturing of the sacramental view of the world that was the traditional view for the first 1,500 years, at least, of the church. So that's going to be a benefit. I won't talk about that here, but that is a benefit. Another benefit I did explore in that essay was the fact that Platonism actually makes theism more plausible than naturalism. So it's actually relevant to the debate over sort of broad metaphysical theories, and I kind of make an argument there. But I guess what I'll mention here, because I think it's maybe relevant sort of practically, I think that Christian Platonism helps secure what I'll call linguistic realism and then avoid relativism, right? So it kind of secures and grounds knowledge in a way that other views struggle with. So like on the Christian Platonic view of the world, there's this tight connection. We'll talk about this between the divine ideas that God creates according to and creatures, of course, and then our concepts, right? Our language and concepts really do pick out essences and natures of things. That essence or nature is what it is in virtue of a divine idea, not in virtue of like social convention or things like that. And so if we care deeply about knowledge, if we care deeply about securing like objective truth and a world that's full of objective and deep meaning, especially given our concepts and the words we use, well, then I think, and I'd like to say more about that, or I could say more about it, but I think Christian Platonism is attractive for that reason.
Okay, so I want to come back to that inconsistent triad we talked about earlier, because some people might, they're just trying to figure out how to follow along. Like, how exactly does your Christian Platonism avoid the inconsistency in the inconsistent triad?
Good. So I am going to reject that third claim. And that third claim was just, if abstract objects exist, then they are independent of God. I'm just going to deal with the bootstrapping worry that God sort of ensnares himself in a vicious explanatory circle. So I'm going to maintain Platonism. I'm going to maintain and seek to maintain that God is the sole ultimate reality, right? The aseity, the sovereignty of God. And so my big challenge has been working on the bootstrapping objection. It keeps sort of popping up, like every time you solve one version of that, like the causal version, it's like, pushing down that rug, it'll pop up somewhere else. So there's like at least 3 different versions that I've discovered. And I actually deal with some of these in great detail in that essay, in that book on divine ontologies. But so I would like to say that at least to my satisfaction, I think I've put the bootstrapping word to rest, but I don't think I'll convince everyone of that fact, but that's the route that I go. I can say more about how I get out of the bootstrapping worry, but just in short, it requires doing some pretty heavy metaphysical spade work in terms of what is a substance and how does a substance have its properties. And so it involves notions of grounding and fundamentality and things like that. I can say more, but that's kind of where I'm headed.
Yeah. And before we get on to the next question, I want to say like that essay in the Divine Ontology book, I really appreciated the way you identified all these different versions of the bootstrapping objection, because I don't think I had ever seen anybody lay out all the different views and was like, oh, okay, this is quite handy. Because I oftentimes feel like the bootstrapping and I'm like, what on earth are we talking about? And it's this hodgepodge of things and you're like, oh no, here's 3 views and here's how I answer all of them. Haha. It's good.
Yeah. So I wish, like I said, I'm satisfied that it's not a real problem, but I don't think I've satisfied William Lane Craig or anything like that, but that's okay. We can keep trying. We can only hope.
Like you said, there's a lot of metaphysical spade work that's being done in this particular essay that we've kind of been alluding to. But in that essay, you're responding to Thomas Ward and his view or version of Christian Platonism, which is called Containment exemplarism. So I know you said there's a lot going on here, but could you just kind of walk us through Ward's view of things and what he ends up saying about the status of abstract objects in God's mind?
Good. So actually, the response to Ward is a separate essay. I didn't have enough space in the one that's going in the Divine Ontologies book. There's just too many objections to this view that I hold, and so I dealt with some, especially the bootstrapping and the unmotivated worry. But Tom Ward, in his book on divine ideas, Low Cambridge Element, that he recently wrote, which is a fantastic book, he just has like a side part, right? Not a huge part of it, but just a side argument against the idea of God making up or creating abstract objects. And so I was really interested in just pulling that piece out and responding to that in my own thinking. But as I was kind of reading his book and thinking about it, I realized there's actually more going on here beneath the surface. And so, so he defends in that book a version of divine exemplarism called containment exemplarism. So let's just back up. So divine exemplarism is a traditional way of making sense of how God created. Traditionally, God's creative activity is understood to be good, sovereign, free, and creative. And then one way to make sense of that is divine exemplarism, which says that God creates according to divine ideas. So we have in God's mind, there's the idea of Drew and Andrew, and he creates according to his idea, the concrete particular, Drew and Andrew and R.T. Mullins, so on for everything that exists, every finite substance that exists. So, and then in Tom's book, Divine Ideas, he defends one specific version of the divine exemplars tradition that he calls containment exemplarism. This is rooted in Duns Scotus thinking, and really I think I can summarize it in 3 simple points for him. So containment exemplarism is the view that God, number 1, creates ex nihilo according to divine ideas. That's just the traditional account of divine exemplarism. Number 2, though, and this is unique to containment exemplarism, divine ideas are about an aspect or part of God. We can talk more about that. And then number 3, God has his ideas that he has by knowing himself, right? So in virtue of God's perfect self-knowledge. So that's his view. And in his little book, he just has a couple pages where he objects to the idea of God creating abstract objects, which I've already alluded to as part and parcel of my own view. So let's see if I can lay out that problem. He thinks that there's the idea of God creating abstract objects is problematic. And to begin to see why, I think we should ask this question, like, what was God thinking about logically prior to creating creatures? And the answer, according to modified theistic activism, were those created abstract objects that serve as exemplars in divine creation of finite substances. But then Ward asks this great question, right? This is a wonderful objection to a view like mine. He says, well, what about that proto-creation? He just calls that proto-creation. Did God know what he was doing when he made these abstract objects? And so basically, Ward's going to raise a dilemma. And here's the dilemma that he raises. He says, on the one hand, if you say no, that God doesn't know what he's doing when he made those abstract objects, well, then God's creation of abstract objects becomes irrational. And of course, that's a problem, right? Because the traditional theist, I just mentioned, maintains that divine creative activity is rational. Or maybe I didn't mention that, but that's also part of the tradition, that it's a rational act. On the other hand, if you say, yes, God knew what he was doing when he made those abstract objects, well, then God must have already had something in mind when he created the abstract objects that function as divine exemplars. But then this other question comes up. Where did he get those ideas, right? The ideas that he already had in mind when he created the abstract objects that function as exemplars. And it seems, according to Ward, that we must postulate a proto-proto creation in order to secure the rationality of God's proto-creation. And the problem, if you can hear the protos here, is that this results in an infinite regress of proto-creations, right? So you have God who must proto-create in order to rationally create, but then he proto-proto-creates in order to rationally proto-create, but then he proto-proto-proto-creates in order to rationally proto-proto-create, and so on, right? And so basically it boils down to this idea that either on this view that God creates abstract objects, either the view is irrational or it's explanatorily vacuous. And so in the part of the essay where I respond to that quickly, I just argue that it's possible to provide an account of God making stuff up that avoids both horns of Ward's dilemma, right? God's proto-creation is neither irrational or explanatory vacuous. Rather, all things considered, it's rational, and so on. I'm sure we'll say a little bit more about it, but that's the essence of his objection.
Yeah, so that way you don't have to go, well, God's proto-create. You don't have to do any of that nonsense.
Yes, we don't want to do that.
Yeah. That's good. So now since we're the Palm Beach Atlantic crew today, I mean, we're going to side with you, Paul. Like, we're not going to stab you in the back here. But some of our listeners, though, they will stab you in the back in a heartbeat. So they're probably going to be thinking, like, Tom Ward's book, it's like the Divine Ideas. It's really cool. It's great. Why should I think that, like, your view is better? So you raise this thing you call the creativity objection to Ward. So just tell us, like, how that objection goes to kind of help people understand what's going on here.
So this was an interesting part of, I just began to think about the rationality piece, the dilemma that he raised. And the more that I kind of thought of his own view, I'm like, wait a minute, there's some tension here, that we need to kind of balance rationality in creating with creativity in creating. And I think I surfaced a problem in Ward's view. So here's kind of how it goes. Both Tom and I agree with this claim that Tom makes in his book. I love the phrase. He talks about God as a totally original artist. I think that's a wonderful metaphor, right? God is creates creatively. But the problem is that Ward's containment exemplarism seems to be inconsistent with the idea of God creating creatively. And so I kind of unpack that in the essay that I wrote in Religious Studies. It just came out. But the idea basically goes like this. So you've got, on Ward's view, you've got God, and then within God, you've got these aspects of God. And these aspects exactly resemble divine ideas, right? So you have the divine idea of being a lion, and that exactly resembles the lionhood that is an aspect of God. You've got the divine idea of R.T. Mullins, and that exactly resembles the aspect of God that is archetypally R.T. Mullins, right? And so on. And so given this, you've got this exact resemblance relation from aspects of God to the divine idea, and then from the divine idea to the finite substance that is the creature created in virtue of that divine idea. So you have like these resemblance relations, which are symmetric, that go from the divine being through the divine idea to the creature. And the problem is it doesn't leave any room for God to create creatively, right? There's no gap from which God to infuse some of his creative magic, right? And it's basically a kind of divine duplication. So I kind of argue it's a kind of model copying as opposed to genuine creativity. And that's what the problem is. So in the essay, I explore all these possible gaps and just argue, given the setup of containment exemplarism, there isn't any space for God to create creatively. So now we've got, number one, Ward's containment exemplarism. On that view, God isn't actually a totally original artist. Moreover, if I could rebut his worry about God making stuff up, right, and show that that's not an irrational act, then I think we have a different model that can have everything that we want: creativity, goodness, rationality, sovereignty, freedom, and all the rest.
So I got a follow-up question on this, I guess. So when I'm looking at Ward's view, I always thought it was weird that like a lion somehow resembles God. When I look at my own self, I'm like, okay, I can resemble God in certain respects. I've got a little bit of wisdom, not anywhere near as much as God. I've got a little bit of like power, but again, not anywhere near as much as God. I've got handsomeness. But I don't know if God's got that because he doesn't have a physical body. So I never understood those aspects of it. But this creativity objection here, so is the idea that like God would have to have a more thin concept of me, a more thin idea of me in order to have some creative room or something? Like, I think I'm missing a little step in this.
So, yeah, that is part of the problem. So what I explore actually in more detail in the essay was, where is that gap where God can exercise some creativity? If he's just duplicating this divine idea in creating you and me and lions and tigers, and that divine idea is just exactly resembling an aspect of God, there's no gap. There's no way for God to exercise his creativity. So I actually explore, well, maybe God creates according to like general types, and then the creativity is in like filling in the attributes or something like that. Or maybe like kind of argue that there's no space there, right? There's no workable way to make that work. Then I explore this idea of maybe there's a kind of generalism where in creating, God creates individual essences. So maybe that's the piece that's left out. He has the general concept of a lion and the attributes of a lion, but he creates Rory the lion. Rory is different than Lenny the lion, and maybe that's it. And argue that there's no workable gap there given his constraints that he sets up. And so what happens is, as it turns out, I think he's committed to the view, I'm pretty sure he's committed to the view, but it'd be nice for Tom to clarify, that God has fully determinate individual concepts that are the divine ideas that God creates according to. And if that's the case, well then it's just a straight duplicate all the way through from the aspect of God. And notice then you have these funny things called aspects, whatever they are, right? I just think they're a new category, right? They're not properties, they're not facts, they're not states of affairs. I don't know what they are. They're just a new kind. So that's a kind of ontological cost. But not just ontological cost. There's, all these members for each substantial kind, right? For every human member, every lion member, they all are also aspects of God. And that's a pretty, at least there's a lot of ontological bloat. So it seems to me that's a theoretical cost to the view. Does that help at all?
Yeah, a little bit. I think Andrew's next question might help clarify some more things in my head.
So, Paul, regarding the creativity argument you raise against Ward, it seems that you're working with a pretty technical definition of creativity. So what is creativity, and how do we distinguish divine creativity from human creativity?
So as you might expect, there's all this literature on those very questions. What is the nature of a creative act? What is creativity? And then there's been, wonderful philosophers exploring the nation of divine creativity. Megan Page wrote a wonderful essay on that title, Divine Creativity and Creating. That's super helpful. But basically, philosophers of creativity such as Amy Kind, Margaret Bowden, Barry Gould, these are people working in this area, widely agree that any creative act, for it to be creative, must include at least two things. And then there's this third thing that's debated. But the two things that pretty much everyone agrees about when it comes to what makes an act a creative act are that the act brings about something that's novel and that has value, right? So there's something new to the world that's brought into being, and it's something that's valuable. Now, most would agree that these are necessary conditions, but there's something else that's sort of required, right, to make the creative act actually creative. And sometimes, like Barry Gout calls this flair. Amy Kine talks about it needs to be like it's a kind of surprisingness to the creative act. This is like the gap problem that we're just talking about with Ward. There's also this criteria of like intentional agency, which is relevant, especially when you talk about like computer art and AI art and things like that. That's all in the debate as well. But flair, surprisingness is this third condition that's needed to make something creative. So that's a little bit about creativity. And then again, I'm happy to employ, this artist metaphor that Tom does in his book. I like that when thinking about divine creativity. So God is like an artist is actually, I think, a helpful metaphor. And then the question is like, what does that mean? What does it mean to be an artist? And intuitively, at least, we could say that an artist is an exemplar of creativity. Amy Kine distinguishes three kinds of creativity there. She calls it person creativity. An artist manifests this person creativity, and then artisanship involves process creativity and product creativity. And so you might think like human artists exhibit to varying degrees these three types of creativity, but God is the totally original artist, right? We would suppose exhibits them to the supreme degree. So the divine act of creating on containment exemplarism is free, sovereign, and rational, I think. But I deny in that paper that it's creative because Ward's God lacks this process creativity, right? He doesn't provide any creative contribution in bringing about it. He's just model copying. He's just duplicating from a divine aspect. That's another way to think about the objection that I'm raising to him with respect to creativity.
Okay, I think I figured out what my struggle is here. So when looking at the different theories of providence, say you're a determinist, you're a Molinist, or you're an open theist, or you could hold simple foreknowledge and have no providence whatsoever, you've got these kind of options. If you're a determinist or a Molinist, God knows all the logical possibilities, and he's actualizing a very specific timeline in different ways, so you get hopefully you don't get determinism on Molinism. But that's going to be model copying, because he knows this is exactly how everything's going to go there. On open theism, God knows all the possibilities, so he's still going to be like doing some model copying, but he doesn't know exactly which timeline, so what those things will do. He's got a really good guess, because he's not an idiot. So I'm curious if a consequence of this kind of view of creativity is like the only option really to really sneak in some creative gap would be some kind of open view of God.
I don't think so, but that is, you're actually hitting on part of the worry. So Megan Page in her essay on divine creativity in creating actually engages what she calls the world actualization model, which is like a very traditional way of thinking about divine creativity that would be very Molinistic, at least in terms of the setup, right? Think of Platonism and his idea that he talks about in Nature of Necessity and other places where, God doesn't create the possible worlds, he just actualizes one of them, right? So and what he creates are the heavens and the earth, right? So you're just actualizing these fully determinate, one of many maximal states of affairs. And so Megan Page in her essay, she argues that on the world actualization model, that model is in tension with divine creativity for the very reason you just made. These are fully specified. There's no like conceptual space. There's no logical space that God is unaware of in actualizing that fully specified state of affairs. So I think there is a worry there. Now, what I would want to say, and I think that same worry carries over to Ward's view. Instead of the WHAM model, I call it the DAM model, the divine aspectual model, I think I call it. But, it's very similar. Not exactly the same because Ward's possible worlds don't include God, right? God is distinct from the possible worlds, the possible stories that he would create. So you make the necessary changes there. Mm-hmm. But here's what I would want to say in reply to that worry about, is open theism the only option that, God can actually create creatively? First of all, I'd say, well, I'm not even sure what to think about possible worlds myself, right? Monday through Thursday, I think I believe in them, but on Fridays, I'm not totally sure, right? So it could just be that there aren't possible worlds. And the other thing I'm really attracted to is a neo-Aristotelian account of substances, which includes a powers ontology. And you can ground a whole lot of your modal reality in finite substances and essences and things like that. So maybe if you follow like Jonathan Jacobs, right, you don't even need possible worlds. Then you won't have that creativity worry about a fully specified thing. The other thing to say, though, is even if there are possible worlds, I think that as long as, so like for Platonism, the possible worlds just exist independent of God, or at least they're just there in some way, right? At least he doesn't work out how they got there. Take a theistic activist and God is responsible for those, right? But for Platonism, he never develops it so much like Morse and Menzel do. I think, though, part of the attraction of theistic activism is that God is responsible for modal reality. So as long as God has freedom in creating modal reality, I think you take away that worry. And that's exactly what my view does in a way that's distinct from the traditional theistic activist. I'll explain that a little bit bit later, but I distinguish like these logical moments in God's creative activity. And that first moment is like following Brian Leftow, the biggest bang, where God spontaneously, freely dreams up all modal reality. And there's complete freedom in that. So you don't have to be an open theist, right? Even if you believe in possible worlds, I think there's a way to do it still.
Okay. So let's talk about some source stuff. So Drew, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, I know that we've been circling this issue of the source question, or how these objects come into being, for a little while. In the article, in your response to Ward, you frame one of the major issues in this conversation around the source question. So could you explain what this question is and how it reflects this issue regarding the creation of abstract objects?
Good. So a key motivation for Tom's view, containment exemplarism, has to do with the dialectic related to what I'm going to call the source question. I don't think he calls it that, but he certainly hovers over this. It's the question, right? Where does God get his ideas? That's the question that he's interacting with. And he actually considers throughout his book at least 5 different possible answers to the source question. And he rules out all of them except the last one, which is his view. I'll just kind of categorize those 5 options and say why Ward rejects each except for the last. So the first option, to the question, where does God get his ideas? The ideas that he has from which he creates the finite substances that are the world. One answer is from nowhere, right? It's just a brute fact that God has the ideas that he has. Now, Ward rejects that one on theoretical grounds, right? All things being equal, explanations are better than non-explanations. And since there's at least one possible explanation, according to Thomas Ward, then that's, better than the brute fact account. Right? So that's number one. Number 2, where does God get his ideas from? The second idea is that he gets them by looking outside himself to a realm of co-eternal abstract objects or forms, right? This would be maybe your traditional Platonist view that has this distinct realm that's independent of God, right? That traditional assumption that I reject in the inconsistent triad. The problem with this, that I would agree with Ward, is that it violates God's sovereignty and freedom, since God is not responsible on that view for the intelligible realm, and God's creative activity only extends then to the material realm. The third option that Ward considers, and this is the one that I was initially interested in reading his work for, is the idea that God makes them up. That's the view that I actually end up defending here. It's not just my view. Brian Leftow would argue for something like that, take it in a slightly different direction. So I'm going to respond to that view in my essay. The fourth possible answer is a very traditional one that Tom's going to reject, and that's the idea that God gets his ideas by knowing himself as imitable. God knows, in virtue of his divine nature, all the ways that his divine nature or essence can be imitated, right? This would be Aquinas. This is a very traditional view. And there's some great discussion in his book about why that view doesn't work. It usually has to do with the idea that there's just no plausible way to explain how creatures are imperfect imitations of God, especially given a strong view of divine simplicity. This leaves the last option. How does God get his ideas? Well, by knowing himself, by knowing his aspects, knowing parts of himself. And so basically the dialectic would be something like this. I argue that third option, the idea that God making stuff up, is a better option than the containment option. I don't argue in that essay that it's like the best overall answer, but if Ward is correct that his view is better than 1, 2, and 4, and I'm correct that my view is better than his, well, then at least that's like prima facie reasons to think that mine is the best view, or at least it deserves consideration. But that's kind of what's going on with the source question.
Paul, part of your response to Ward gives a modification of divine rationality. So you acknowledge both irrational and non-rational actions. It seems bizarre to speak of God being non-rational in certain divine acts. So could you work through this part of your response for us?
Good. Yeah, you're right. This is really good. I was just at a conference in the UK, and we were talking about, does God have brute desires? And this is very similar to the move that I think I'm making with respect to this non-rational act. So earlier, remember, we mentioned like Ward's dilemma that was raised against the idea of God making stuff up or proto-creating, right? So on the supposition then, so one view is that having something in mind is a requirement of rationality. Like, let's just suppose that he's right, that having something in mind is a requirement of rationality. I argue that it doesn't follow, even on that supposition, that God's proto-creation of divine ideas is irrational. It could be that proto-creation is neither rational nor irrational. Rather, it's non-rational or irrational. And so let me just give you a few more reasons to at least motivate that idea. So Barry Scout, again, a philosopher working on philosophy of creativity, he notes the idea, for an act to be judged as rational or irrational, it must be the subject of rational assessment. But spontaneous acts are not subject to rational assessment. Therefore, spontaneous acts are neither rational nor irrational, but non-rational. Okay, so that's coming from philosophy of art, philosophy of creativity from Barry Scout. Since, as I've characterized it, proto-creation is a spontaneous act of God, well then, on the assumption that God must have something in mind as a requirement of rationality, why not just argue that proto-creation is non-rational, right? And you could give an argument from analogy. So this is an argument that I give in this essay. I said, it's commonly thought, following Kant, that human artistic creativity is free, playful, spontaneous, and original, right? So human artistic creativity is, quote, logically the opposite of imitation, is Kant. Moreover, artists recognize a place in aesthetic creation for creating without any prior vision of the thing being created. And so by analogy, it could be argued that God's artistic creativity is like the human case, but supremely so, like utterly free, playful, spontaneous, and original. But in saying all that, and this will be the last thing I maybe want to say, in thinking up possible creatures, I would want to just say that God doesn't violate the necessities of logic, nor is perfectly rational or good nature. There's nothing irrational to this act, as far as I can tell, of proto-creation. Moreover, to be a genuine creation and not mere imitation, as I've argued, proto-creation seems to require that kind of playfulness and spontaneity and freedom. So I think it's reasonable to think that proto-creation is this, because this is like a primordial act, right? The first logical moment of divine creation. It's reasonable to think that it's a basic, non-rational, yet supremely creative act of God, even as the complex divine creative act, all things considered, is in fact a rational act, right? So it's a logically complex act in the same way that theologians, right now I'm reading on the atonement, writing a chapter. Many theologians talk about Christ's work of atonement as a logically complex act. I want to say the same thing about God's creative activity. It's a logically complex act. And there's aspects of it, specifically this primordial proto-creating, that's a non-rational, spontaneous part of this divine creative act.
I've got a question that's related to this. It might be an objection, or it might be a way to fix the view. I'm not really entirely sure yet. So the biggest thing here is I don't understand why I should say that God creates abstracta, because to create involves some kind of volition or some kind of free activity on God's part. I'm curious, why not just say God emanates abstracta? Because if you want to say that God's the ultimate source of reality, creation is not the only option here. Emanation is another one. So emanation is when certain things just necessarily follow from the divine nature without any volition at all on God's part. So emanation is perfectly consistent with the claim that God is the divine foundation of all of reality. And you've already got that claim in your view. So you could say that concepts and propositions and whatever else you want to have, you could say those emanate from God, and that God creates a universe ex nihilo that fits his concepts and propositions. And I think this would avoid having to say that God creates possibilities. So you don't have to go, well, is it possible for God to create possibilities? You don't have to do any of that nonsense. So I don't know. What do you think about this idea of maybe just saying emanation instead of creation?
Good. Yeah, I think even Keith Yandel in the earlier 6 views on the problem of God in abstract objects, he argued for something like this, right? Yeah, this is a great question, and I think it illustrates the fact that we're just in deep waters here, that we're seeking this account of reality in which all facts, including modal facts, which are in many ways are the hardest to sort of tie them together in a nice little package, we're seeking to ground all facts in deity in some way that's consistent, philosophically attractive, and of course theologically attractive within the bounds of scripture and tradition, and appropriately understood and all that as well. So I love your question because it presses that edge. But here's what I would want to say. You asked, why not go for divine emanation of abstracta? And I think one reason to avoid divine emanation actually comes from theology, more specifically the doctrine of creation. And so at rock bottom, if you think of the traditional doctrine of creation, it basically asserts that the most fundamental distinction in all of reality is that between creator and creature. That's it. That's the fundamental distinction. Everything is either creator or creature. There's no third thing that's uncreated that's not God. But here's where the problem with divine emanation, I think, surfaces, because now you've got this third thing that's not God, but it's uncreated, right? And that seems to go against a very traditional way of understanding the doctrine of creation and this sort of fundamental distinction between all of reality. And so it'd be nice if we had an account that could maintain that distinction, since it seems to be doing a lot of work with aseity and sovereignty and all these debates that are happening. And so that leads to, I guess, my second thing that I'd want to say, maybe last thing on this. I do think that my modified theistic activism, along with that logically complex divine creative activity, gives this account where you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. At least that's what I want to have, right?
Yeah.
So let me say more about these logical moments that I've kind of alluded to, because I think it helps with your problem. Although you're going to see your questions surface even in these logical moments. So that's why I want to kind of go through them. So here's kind of where I'm at with understanding this. I distinguish 3 logical moments to God's free, rational, and sovereign creative activity. In the first logical moment, I've already mentioned you have the biggest bang. I'm just borrowing that language from Brian Leftow. I love that phrase. The idea is that God freely and spontaneously dreams up all creaturely possibilities, including possible individuals. That would be divine ideas, and then possible worlds, if they are there. That would just be conjunctions of divine thoughts or propositions. That's the first logical moment. That's the free, spontaneous thing that we've been talking about with the debate over creativity and Ward. Now, here's where your question comes in. The second logical moment. I call it like the bigger bang because I don't know what else to say, because you have the biggest bang, the bigger bang, and then
the lesser bang.
So it's like this really, it's the middle thing, the lesser bang, whatever. It's like, I don't know. I don't have the best label for it. But in the second logical moment, so here it is. God necessarily creates via the divine will the abstracta, that is the properties and relations that populate the Platonic heaven. So if the first moment is this free, spontaneous, creative act of the divine intellect, the second moment is a necessary creative logical moment that flows from where God takes those divine ideas and creates abstracta, such that in the third logical moment, the Big Bang, God will create the physical universe, and he will use these Platonic entities to structure the actual concrete world that he creates. So you have like a single yet complex divine act that covers the world without overlap or gap and accounts for all metaphysical possibilities, including essentialist facts and things like that. So anyway, yeah, so you're right. That question about divine emanation is going to surface at some point if abstracta are necessary beings. So I'm willing to say that there are some unlovely aspects to my view, but I think all things considered, I'm willing to pay those prices in the places that I need to, because I want to maintain the sole ultimacy of God and the creator-creature distinction given theology.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for being on the show today. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation.
Thanks, Ryan. It's been great to be with you. And Drew and Andrew, it's been good to see you guys as well. Look forward to seeing all you at Palm Beach Atlantic and in class this fall.
And there you have it, another episode of the Reluctant Theologian podcast. Stay tuned for more episodes on philosophical theology.